Okay. What I was wondering is, this was my last question, but I'm doing it first. What actually started the discussions, which they're based on the Mishnah? How many rabbis are there? Because we get some names, and it's quite interesting when we hear the history, but how many are there altogether? Were they there at the same time? Were they selected? Or did they just want to be involved? Or did they all just turn up occasionally? That's my first question. My second question.
Do we answer that first? Shall I answer that first then?
Okay.
So, the Mishnah was put together, as you know, by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who lived from 135 to about 220. He was the last of the generations of the Tanaim. It's said that he was born on the day that Rabbi Akiva died. And they say about this, the sun set and the sun rises. That Rabbi Akiva died and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was born. So of course Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not learn under the tutelage of Rabbi Akiva, but he did learn under the tutelage of Rabbi Akiva's pupils, his famous 5 pupils. So he was the last of the generations of the Tanaim. And that was a period of time of about 200 years, from the time of the destruction of the temple until the writing of the Mishnah. Maybe not quite 200 years, probably 150 years. After that came a period of time of about 250 years of the Amoraim, and they were the rabbis of the Gemarrah. They were later rabbis who then took the Mishnah, as we are now, and discussed the Mishnah, and that's what we're reading about now. So we're talking about a period of around about 450 to 500 years worth of different rabbis. So no, they didn't all live at the same time. Some of them obviously were contemporaneous. Some of them were master and pupils, teacher and pupils. Many of them, as you'll see in this morning's Gemarrah, were relatives of one another. So that answers that first part of the question. The second part of your question was, how did they all get there, and did they have to be invited, or did they just show up? I think certainly there was a degree of nepotism, in that the senior rabbis will have had their sons and nephews and what have you, who they would have been familiar with, and they would have taught, and they would have obviously learned. But there was definitely an interchange between, and we've seen this already in our Gemarrah, between Bavel and Yerushalayim. Well, it's not Yerushalayim actually; it was actually in the north. But Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. And people who were of a high caliber were often, if you like, I don't know whether they were tapped up or whether they were sent, but people of, I think it's a situation of cream rising to the top. Those who became recognized as great scholars were sent to the great Academies of Learning in Bavel. There was Pumbedisa, there was Surya, there was Nahardia, and then in Eretz Yisrael there was the Yavne, and there was Tzipori later on. These were all the great places of learning, where all these rabbis would sit around and have the discussions that we're reading about now. So does that answer your first question?
It does. So there's no point getting a list of who there were, because it's not going to help. They just pop up when they have something to say.
That's why this Steinsaltz is so useful, because it gives you a background of each of the characters as they arise.
So then I think you've answered my second question. My second question was, at the same time as the discussions, we're doing judges at the moment, but at the same time as the discussions, judges is already
Sharon is showing you a book there. If you have a look at Sharon's screen,
okay.
Who's who in the Talmud? That would be a useful thing for you to look at, to give you some kind of context on who's who.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Sharon. We'll do it for the book club, shall we, Sharon? At the same time as the discussions, judging's already happening in both everywhere. So these discussions, are they all going to have retrospective effect? In other words, when they've decided how many judges and how many people can judge a particular matter, does it just start at a particular point in time? In other words, is there a point when we get to some definitive decision where they're going to say, right, this is where we start?
Yeah. Basically, that was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi writing the Mishnah. And that's why he wrote down the Mishnah. Because until that time, everybody had a version of the oral law. And in an ideal world, of course, everybody would have the same version of the oral law. But I don't know if you've ever played the game Chinese Whispers, where you go around the room and you whisper something in somebody's ear. By the time it gets back to the first person, it's completely changed. Imagine Chinese whispers going on over a period of 1,500 years, which is basically what happened. Because the oral law was given to Moshe. If you look in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, it will tell you Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. That includes the oral law, passed it on to Yehoshua. Yeshua passed it on to the elders. The elders passed it on to this one, that one, and the other one. And this was all oral transmission. And of course, it wasn't a linear thing. It was a pyramidal thing. So by the time you get halfway down the pyramid, you can have 10, 15, 20, 1,000, hundreds, who knows how many different versions of the oral law. And everybody, every town, every rabbi, every bet din, every place would conduct halakha according to their understanding of the oral law. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came along at the end of the Mishnaic period in around about 200. And bearing in mind, by this time, the temple had been destroyed, the centrality of the temple had gone. And he said, this is no good. We've got too many different versions here. So he wasn't the first to write it all down, but he was. But he wrote, his became the accepted norm. So by the time the Mishnah, once the Mishnah was written down, that was your starting point for, if you like, we wipe the slate clean. This is now the accepted version of the oral law. All the other versions that don't accord with the Mishnah, which hitherto have been used by various different places, are put to one side. The Mishnah is the one, and the same thing happened, by the way, in the 16th century with the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was not the first, Rabbi Yosef Karo was not the first by a long way to write down and to codify Jewish law, but his became the accepted version. Not accepted universally, but it became the almost universally accepted version of the Code of Jewish Law. So the answer to your question is yes. The Mishnah was a reset button, if you like. All the previous versions that had gone on from there were now collated into the Mishnah and were understood to be the definitive version. The problem was, of course, that everybody sat around and discussed that definitive version, and it wasn't quite as tight as you might think it was. And that's why we ended up with the Gemarrah, which then discusses the Mishnah and tries to make it tighter. Then, as the generations went through, the various different poskim, the Geonim, and then the Rishonim, and then the Achronim, and then the contemporary poskim, took the Gemarrah and then distilled it like a distillery, and out of the bottom comes our today's halakha.
So the third question, I think, really probably doesn't need answering. I just want to be more definitive, but for the judges that we're doing now, 3 judges are needed to decide monetary cases. One can do it if authorized by the parties, both parties, and one can do it if authorized in Israel or by Bavel. Is that correct? Or are we going to change it again?
You'll have to wait and see. That's where we're standing at the moment, correct. that is a very good summary, an excellent summary of where we're holding at the moment.
Okay. What really bothers me is the two judges that have admitted to making mistakes. I mean, I suppose judges do make mistakes, but A, how do they know? B, why were they trying things when they didn't really know what they were doing in the first place? And why aren't the litigants entitled to compensation? If not, they're not getting it from the judges, who they've been told are not liable because they were given consent. Who's going to give them compensation? And how, anyway, does anybody know? I don't get the two mistakes. I mean, is it just an irrelevance?
So I suppose the mistakes are brought to light when somebody would challenge it, in the same way as you have in most systems. You have systems of appeal. You know, if you go into the magistrate's court, you can appeal to a higher court, and eventually you get to the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords and all that stuff. And you can see that judges made mistakes. Now, I'm not aware of an official appeal system, but it could well be, and this is often what happened in these places, is a more senior rabbi would come to town and would then be told about a certain case, and he would say, no, you did that wrong, that wasn't the right sack. In the same way as a more formalized appeal system would do that. Now, in terms of compensation, you could ask the same question about any system of justice. For example, in the UK, which most of us are familiar with, if a court of appeal overturns a verdict from a lower court, those judges are not liable for any losses that the litigants have.
The judges aren't, but then the litigants might be entitled to compensation.
Not from the judges.
Not from the judges. Not from the judges.
So we're talking here about liability on the judges.
I understand that, but do the judges just say, right, we're not liable? Or is it the fact then that you're saying that there may have been a higher appeal and the decision may have been reversed?
I think that once a decision is shown to be wrong, then there will be some facility for righting that wrong. It's not just, oh, well, we were wrong, tough.
Right. Okay.
But the indemnity on the judges has to be, or else nobody's going to be a judge, are they?
Yeah, no, I understand that. I just was trying to understand what happened to the litigants.
Final question. Have a retrial.
Final question. Are we learning from the discussions? Are we learning from the conclusions? Or is it a mixture, an amalgam of the two?
It depends what your goal is. Some people's goal is to learn the bottom line. If you remember right at the beginning, we had Dave Patrick join us, and he couldn't handle all this going back and forth. Dave Patrick's a bottom line man. So if you're after the bottom line and you're not interested how to get to the bottom line, then Gemarrah is not for you. We are learning from the process, and we're also learning as we go along the origins of what we today do as a halakha. For example, last week, we spoke about the idea of yoreh and yadin, of how a person gets smicha and how a person becomes a dayan, and that's very interesting to us. And this is the origin for us. But if you're learning Gemarrah to learn the actual halakha, how to be an observant Jew, there are better books to learn that from. The idea of Gemarrah is to learn from the process. It is to understand how the process goes, and it is to immerse yourself, as the rabbis would say, in the sea of Torah, to immerse yourself in holy matters, and it's an intellectual exercise.
Absolutely.
Which many people, by the way, there are many people who are not observant at all, who learn Gemarrah because they find it an intellectually stimulating.
Exactly. Okay, you've answered my questions. Okay. Thank you.
May I just add one thing, just from the perspective of being a learner and not being a rabbi, is that it's so important to look at the questions that are behind the questions that they seem to be answering. because it is a guide for adapting to new circumstances as a Jewish community or as a Jew, whether it's exile, whether it's what kind of tyrant or what kind of world order there is. That's often being the question behind the question of what is the halacha. And I look to it a lot for that purpose, to try to make sure I'm asking the right questions to understand, as Jonathan Sachs said, what we're about.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think we can learn a lot from the context, and that's why I'm very keen, as you know, to put things into historical context, because we need to know what the historical context was and why a decision was made. The way it was made is often due to the historical context, and we can learn from that, because at the end of the day, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. We are only regurgitating and recycling things that have happened in perhaps in a more sophisticated or more technological way, but the concepts are very much the same. So I think that's a very good point, Sharon. Right, let's do some Gemarrah. And let me share you my screen first of all. Okay, can you see my screen there? Thumbs up if you can see the Gemarrah. Yeah, thank you. Okay, now we left it last week where we had Rabbi Chiya. Rabbi Chiya went to Rebbe and asked if his brother's son, this is what we learned last week. He went to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and he said, my brother's son is going down to Bavel. This answers your question a little bit, Julia. Rabbi Barcana was going down to Bavel. Why was he going down to Bavel? Because either he had, inverted commas, outgrown the Jerusalem Academy, or the Eretz Israel Academy, and he was going up to Oxford, as it were. That's how the Babylonians would view it, that he was going up to Bavel. Or for the opposite reason, that Bavel needed a new top dog scholar and he was going to boost their faculty. But either way, you can see that this was an exchange of rabbis and ideas, and we had earlier on a rabbi that went the other way from Bavel to Eretz Israel. So there was this exchange of ideas and exchange of rabbis. So he was going down to Bavel, and Rabbi Chiya goes to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and says, my nephew's going down to Bavel, can you give him smicha? And he says, yoreh? And he says, yoreh. Yes, can he teach? Yes, he can teach. That's smicha. Yadin? Yadin. Can he be a dayan for monetary matters? Yes, he can. He gets permission. Yatir bechorot. Can he paskin halacha on blemishes on animals, whether they are permanent or temporary? Yatir. Yes, he can. So this rabbi now, Rabbi Barcana, has approbation from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in all three fields. Yoreh, which is the smicha that you get for being able to paskin shailas on permitted and forbidden things like kashrut, Shabbat, and those kind of things. Yadin, that is your dayanot for monetary cases, what's called choshen mishpat. And yatir bechorot doesn't apply so much today. That is the allowing the animals. And so Rabbi Barcana has got a full house. He's got 3 degrees here. You'll remember that I was careful to describe Rabbi Barcana as the brother's son, rather than use the generic term nephew. And that's where we left it last week. So now we're going to carry on another story, very similar story, and you'll see why I called him his brother's son. We are, if you're in the big boys Gemarrah, we're at the bottom of Daf Hey Amud Aleph, page 5a, right at the bottom. If you're in the art scroll, it's on page 5a at the bottom. And if you're in the Steinsaltz, you're with me over here. So, Ki hava nechet Rav leBavel. Now another chap's going to Bavel, a chap called Rav, a very famous rabbi called Rav. He was also going to Bavel. Amalei Rabbi Chiya leRabbi. Rabbi Chiya said to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Ben achuti yored leBavel. Now, it's not my brother's son that's going down to Bavel, it's my sister's son who's going down to Bavel. So Rabbi Chiya has got two nephews now, one who he describes as his brother's son, one who he describes as his sister's son, and this sister's son is now going down to Bavel, and he asks the same question, Yore? Can he paskin halachot of heter ve'issa, permitted and forbidden things? Yes, he can. Yadin. Can he adjudicate monetary matters? Yes, he can. He has that qualification. Yatir bechorot. Can he deal with the blemishes on firstborn animals? Al yatir. No, he cannot. Rebbe does not give permission to Rav, the nephew of Rabbi Chiya, the son of his sister, apparently, to allow him to give these psak halacha in Bechorot. So Rav, unlike Rabbi Barcana, has only got 2 degrees. He's got Yore, he's got Yadin, but he's not got Yatir. And the Gemara will tell us, we probably won't get to it today, probably be next week or the week after, because I'm not here next week. I'll talk about that in a minute. Next time we learn, we will get to it probably. Why? And it's fascinating why Rebbe did not allow Rav to paskin on these Bechorot. But you'll have to wait for that exciting little episode in a bit. So, the obvious question is this. The Gemara asks a question. Mai shna lemar deka kari ben achi, umai shna lemar deka kari ben achuti. Why did Rabbi Chiya refer to Rabbi Barcana as his brother's son and Rav as his sister's son? Now, you'll say to me, what kind of a daft question is that? One was his brother's son and one was his sister's son. Obvious, isn't it? The answer is, no, it wasn't obvious. Apparently, Rabbi Chiya did not have a sister. So why did he refer to Rav? Well, didn't have a full sister anyway. You're going to see in a second at the bottom here, there's a family tree, which I'm going to show you in a sec. So the Gemara is asking a question. Why did he refer to one as his brother's son and one as his sister's son? And if you'll say, Hachi havamase, that's actually what happened. It really was his sister's son and his brother's son. V'ha'amar, but haven't we said? You always know that when it begins v'chitema, that it's a hypothesis, and v'ha'amar, you know that our hypothesis is going to be shot down. That's a very classic Gemarrah language, and the tune for doing it is that the way I said it before, and that was especially for Leon because I know he's been waiting for a bit of tune for a good few weeks. So you'll say v'chitema hachi havamase, and if you'll say that was really the case, it was his brother's son and his sister's son, v'ha'amar mar. But haven't we said Aivu, that's the name of a person, v'chana, it's another name of a person, v'sheila, umarta, v'Rabbi Chiya, all those people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, kulhu b'nei abar bar acha karsala mikafre havu. All those 5 people were the sons of Abba bar acha karsala, who came from Kafri. Marcel, where's Kafri? Can't hear you. Unmute, Marcel. Marcel, unmute. Press your unmute.
Yes. I don't know where. I mean, the only Capri I know is in Italy, but
I think it's Capri.
It will be.
I think it probably is somewhere around there. That's where Caffrey is, anyway. Wherever Caffrey is, that's where it's from. Okay, Marcel, that's your homework for this week. Find out where Caffrey is for next week, please.
Yes.
Okay, so let's have a look at the. Let's just carry on at the end of this little section. Rav bar Achu dehava bar Achte. Rav Barcana bar Achua delav bar Achte. So it turns out that Rav was his brother's son, but he was also his sister's son. Right? Rav was the son of Rabbi Chiya's brother and Rabbi Chiya's sister. Hang on a minute. What's going on here? Is this incest? Have we got a brother and a sister getting married to one another and having a child called Rav? First of all, if that was the case, Rav would be a mamzer. And we're not told that Rav is a mamzer. So this is a very peculiar Gemarrah. What's going on? The Gemarrah tells us that Rav was his sister's son and his brother's son, and Rabbi Barcana was only his brother's son, and that's why he referred to Rav as his sister's son. But in order to understand that, we have to go to the bottom of Rav Steinsaltz's page, and he very kindly gives us the family tree. Let me explain to you. You can breathe a sigh of relief. There is no incest going on in the Amoraim over here. So we have Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba, the son of Acha, who came from Caffrey. There's Rabbi Acha. He had a son, Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba married a lady. We don't know her name. And from that lady, he had four sons. He had Chana, Sheila, Marta, and Ivu. Okay? Chana had a son called Rabba bar Chana. And that was our first one. That was the one he described. That was the one Rabbi Chiya, over here, described as his brother's son. Correct? You can see that from the family tree. Rabbi Chiya had a brother called Chana, and his son was Rabba. Rabba bar Chana was the guy who went to Bavel at the end of last week's shiur, and he was called his brother's son. Rav was the one who went to Bavel this morning and is described as his sister's son. And this is how it worked. Rav's father was Ivu, the son of Rabbi Abba from his first wife. Rabbi Abba married again, a second wife, and they had a son called Chiya, Rabbi Chiya. Okay, so Rabbi Chiya is a half brother of Chana and a half brother of Ivu. So that makes Rav, forget the left-hand side of the screen. That makes Rav exactly the same relative to him as Rabba. He's the son of a half brother. Rabba is the son of Chana, half brother of Chiya. Rav is the son of Ivu, half brother of Chiya. You with me so far, everyone? Yeah? Okay. Now, this second wife of Rabbi Abba also had a first husband, right? Who presumably had died before, or they were divorced, I don't know, before she married Rabbi Abba. And with that first husband, they had a daughter called Ima. They had a daughter called Ima. Ima, the half-sister of Chiya, married Ivu, the half-brother of Chiya. But Ivu and Ima, of course, were not related at all, because Ivu's parents were Rabbi Abba and his first wife, and Ima's parents were Rabbi Abba's second wife and her first husband. So you can see from here that Ivu and Ima were not related at all. So there was no incest going on at all. But Rabbi Chiya quite correctly referred to Rav as his sister's son. His sister's son. It was his half-sister. Rabba was his half-brother's son. Rav happened to be his half-sister's son and his half-brother's son. So there was no incest at all. It's very simple. There were lots of different marriages going on here. Ivu, from Rabbi Abba and his first wife, married Ima from the second wife and the first husband of Rabbi Abba, and they had a child called Rav. So that is the scenario why Rabbi Chiya called Rav his sister's son. Now, the obvious question is, why did he call him his sister's son? He was also his brother's son. He could have also just as easily referred to him as his brother's son. I think the simple answer to that is that if he'd have said his brother's son, he wouldn't have known which of these it would have been. It could have been Rabba, could have been Rav, or it could have been any other children of Sheba, Marta, or Ivu. By saying it was his sister's son, it could only be Rav, because he was the only one that was Rabbi Chiya's sister's son. So I think that the reason he recalled him his sister's son was because that was the easiest way of identifying to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who he was talking about. But the Gemara is going to suggest to us a couple of reasons why he was referred to as his sister's son. What has this got to do with 3 judges for monetary matters? Absolutely nothing. It is a tangent to a tangent, which is why some people study Gemarrah in answer to Julia's question earlier on, because it's an intellectual exercise. Whilst we're talking about Rabbi Chiya and whilst we're talking about Samicha, we'll go and say, oh, hang on a minute, why did he call him his sister's son? And now we're going to learn something interesting about that from the Gemarrah, which has got nothing to do with our subject matter. Okay, does everybody understand the mishpachology there? Does anybody want me to go through that again? No, everybody's happy. Good. Okay, let's go back up the page. So we're now right at the bottom of 5a, and we're going to go over to 5b. So he referred to him as his sister's son. And if you want to say, that's the Gemara speak for saying, I'm going to make another suggestion now. But and if you wish to say that the reason that he called him my sister's son was as follows, over the page, Al Shem Chochmato, because he was so clever. Rav, who was one of the main rabbis of his generation, Rav and Shmuel were the 2 main rabbis of their generation. Because Rav was such a clever person, he referred to him as his sister's son, because there is a pasuk in Mishlei. Mishlei, it's over here for you on the screen. Proverbs chapter 7, verse 4, if you want to look it up. Emor la chochma achoti at. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. What's that talking about? Well, you have to go into Mishlei and have a look. What it's talking about is Mishlei is Proverbs, as you know. It's pithy sayings which were written by King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, supposedly the wisest of all men. I'm not altogether sure about that. He had 1,000 wives at least, so that's not very clever. But anyway, supposedly the cleverest of men. And one of his pithy sayings in Mishlei, in Proverbs, was Emor la chochma achoti at. In other words, he's saying, you need to say to yourself, I want to surround myself with wisdom. Achoti at, you are my sister. If you're my sister, you are very close to me. Stephen, are you trying to tell me something? Oh no, I think he's talking to Hillary. Okay. So if you have as your sister, you're very close to your sister. At least you should be, and you want to have your sister around you all the time. So emor la chochma, say to wisdom. In other words, make sure that you surround yourself at all times with wisdom. That is what the pasuk in Mishlei is trying to teach us. It's trying to basically tell us, stay away from idiots and surround yourself with wisdom. And because wisdom and sister are referred to in that pasuk, the Gemara makes a suggestion that Rabbi Chiya was hinting to Rebbe. Remember, the scenario is Rabbi Chiya is going to Rebbe to try and get permission for his nephew to get smicha and to get all these things. So of course he's hinting without actually saying, you know, my nephew Rav is a genius. He's a very clever fellow. He's hinting to that by calling him my sister's son. That's the suggestion of the Gemara. So fine, that's a nice idea. Now we are going to get to it. Now I didn't think we'd get to this, but we're going to get to it. We're going to find out now why, if Rav is so clever, why did Rebbe, the Nasi, remember Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he's the one giving out the permission, why did he only give him 2 out of 3 degrees? Why did he only give him Yora and Yadin Yadin, but he didn't give him Yatir Yatir? What was the reason for that? And we're going to find that out now. The Gemara asks, Yatir Bechoret, can he paskin shilas of blemishes in animals? Al Yatir, no he can't, says Rebbe. My Tama, what was the reason? We're not told the reason by Rebbe. This is the Gemara proposing a couple of different reasons why it might have been that Rebbe would not give permission to Rav to paskin these shilas. My Tama, what's the reason? Ilema, if you will say, Mishum de lo Chakim, if you'll say, well, he wasn't clever enough, he didn't know enough. Haka Amrinan de Chakim Tuva. We've just said a minute ago that he was really clever. And that's why he called him my sister's son. He was a genius. So that can't be the reason. So the Gemara dismisses that and says, no, if you'll tell me it's because he wasn't clever enough, nah, that can't be. We've already said that he was clever enough. Ela rather, mishum de la rabikia b'mumei. He didn't have any experience in these blemishes. There's a fellow that had sat in the Beis HaMedrash all his life. He'd never been out in the fields. He didn't know what an animal looked like. He certainly didn't know what a blemish looked like. He didn't know whether a blemish was permanent or temporary. Not a question of being clever. He just didn't have the experience. You can't ask somebody to paskin a shaila unless he's actually had experience. So that's the Gemara. No, the Gemara says no. He was a clever fellow, very clever fellow, but he wasn't an expert in blemishes. Says the Gemara. Gemara says, no, I'm not. But Rav, didn't Rav himself tell us in a different situation, Shmona Asar Chadashim Gidalti Eitzel Roa Behema. For 18 months, I grew up by a animal shepherd. What do they call him? What do they call an animal shepherd? A herdsman. That's the word I'm looking for. A herdsman.
Johnny, you're cutting in and out a little bit for some reason.
I think it might be your thing, Sharon, because you were going in and out for me as well. Anybody else having trouble hearing me? No. You are, Leon. You're having trouble hearing me? Okay. I don't know what to do about that because it may be that everybody in the world is using Zoom right now. I don't really know what to do. I will just have to carry on. If it gets too bad, then we'll all have to leave and restart. If it gets too bad and you can't hear anything, just wave and shout. Rav says that he grew up for 18 months. He spent 18 months with a herdsman in order to learn Leda, in order to know Eze mum kavua ve'eze mum over. What kind of blemish is permanent and what kind of blemish is temporary? So that doesn't wash. We can't say he wasn't an expert. He told us himself he spent 18 months living with a herdsman. He's done a stage, as they would call it here, with a herdsman, and he's learned everything there is to know about blemishes. So your answer, Gemarrah, over here, that he was not an expert in blemishes, doesn't hold water. So that can't be the reason why he wasn't given permission. And now we come to a really strange answer of the Gemarrah. Ela lachlok lo kavod l'Rabbi Barcana. He denied Rav the permission to to deal with these questions of animals in order to give kavod, in order to give honor to his half-brother. No, it's his cousin, isn't it? To his cousin, Rabbi Barcana, who was last week's fellow. So in other words, Rebbe has boosted up Rabbi Barcana at the expense of Rav. And he's making Rabbi Barcana higher than Rav. Rabbi Barcana has all three permissions. Rav is denied the third permission and only has two. And the Gemarrah says that the whole reason why Rebbe did that was not because Rav wasn't qualified to do so, but because he wanted to give a boost of kavod, of honor, to Rabbi Barcana, which I find very, very strange. I find that very strange because what he said, you have a look over here in the Steinsaltz, he said, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wanted to ensure that Rabbi Barcana would be treated with respect. So he made sure that there was an area of halacha with regard to which the people would not be able to consult with Rav and would need to consult with Rabbi Barcana instead. So in other words, Rav was clearly the top guy. And if they both go down to Bavel, and they were obviously contemporaneous because they were first cousins, they both go down to Bavel, and there's Shilas there. There's going to be a massive queue at Rav's door, and poor Rabbi Barcana is going to have nobody there. I remember this when I was registered at one point with a general practice in Prestwich, and there were it was a group practice, and there was always a full waiting room. Not that I went very often, but when I did go, there was always a full waiting room, but there was always one of the doctors there prowling around looking for customers. And the reason he was prowling around is that nobody liked him. Nobody would go to him. Everybody else was willing to wait for ages for an appointment for the other doctors. But this chap couldn't get anybody to go to see him because nobody liked him. And I have this picture in my head of poor Rabbi Barcana in this situation. Everyone's queuing up to see Rav, and he's sat there on his Jack Jones with nobody coming to see him, and it's really sad. So Rebbe preempted that and realized that this might happen. So he gave Rabbi Barcana exclusive rights to judge on this particular subject by denying that permission to Rav. Now, what we're not told is whether Rebbe explained this to Rav and took him on one side and said, look, you know, we know that you're the cleverest, you know, you're the sharpest pencil in the box, but, you know, poor old Chana, we need to give him a bit of a boost. So, you know, I hope you don't mind, but I'm not going to give you this this permission. Or we don't know whether he did that or whether he just didn't give it and Rav had no idea why that was done. But that's the Gemarrah's suggestion. The Gemarrah comes up with another suggestion. It doesn't dismiss that suggestion with an anti-proof, if you like, but it does come up with another suggestion which indicates, I think, to the reader that the Gemarrah itself isn't entirely satisfied with that answer. Rabbi Chiya often says this: the more answers there are to a question, the less satisfactory any of them are. So the Gemarrah comes up with another suggestion, which is also a little bit counterintuitive, really. So he goes like this: Ibait Ema, and if you want to say it, there's a different reason. Mishum ha gufei, the Rav Bakia mamume tfei. actually, the reason I didn't give him permission is because he knows too much about blemishes. He's such an expert in blemishes. He spent 18 months, night and day, with this herdsman, learning everything there is to know about it. He is so knowledgeable. He's too knowledgeable about this subject. V'sharei mumei de lo yodei enoshi. And what will happen is, he will come along and he will say something is kosher, because it is kosher, because he has noticed a small point on an animal which on a tiny point of halacha makes it kosher, and he'll say this animal is kosher. And other less knowledgeable people, when Rav has gone, either when he leaves Bavel or after he's passed on, less knowledgeable judges will come along and will permit something because they thought that's what Rav had permitted, but only Rav was the one that was clever enough to spot this difference. And so they will make mistakes. They will permit things which are actually forbidden. So v'sharei mumei de la yodi enasha. He will permit things that other people wouldn't. V'amrei, and later on people will say, ki hai gavna shra Rav. Back then, this was permitted by Rav. V'atu mishrei mum over, and they will then permit an animal which with something which would turn out to be a temporary blemish when really it's a permanent blemish. So they would make a mistake because they wouldn't be as clever as Rav. Just, we're going to have to stop here, but just as an aside, there is very much a halachic, what's the word? A precedent to this. You will often find that rabbis will forbid things which are permitted, technically permitted, because it's too difficult to explain why it's permitted, and they are frightened that other people will take the precedent from a case and incorrectly apply it to other cases. My rabbi in Manchester, who's a wonderful man, used to do a similar thing to me. If I ever went with a kashrut shaila, I don't know, let's say we traced up a knife or something, or I thought we'd traced up a knife. So I'd go to Rabbi Goldberg and I'd tell him the scenario, and we did this, that, and the other with the knife. And he would say to me, okay, he'd say to me, actually, there's nothing wrong with a knife, it's completely kosher. But your wife won't believe you, so because she's very frum, she won't believe you. So go home and kasher it, and everything will be fine. But actually, you don't really need to kasher it. And that's an example of what they're saying here with Rav. That Rav, Rebbe was frightened that Rav would do like Rabbi. If Rabbi Goldberg had said to me, "It's okay, it's fine, go away," and it doesn't need kashering. Next time when they got a similar thing that wasn't quite the same, then we might have just, my wife might have just said, well, it's last time Rabbi Goldberg said it was okay, we don't need to do it, so we don't need to do it, and that would be a mistake. So the same idea. So there is definitely halachic precedent that occurs today on the basis, not that he wouldn't be given permission to pass him, but rabbis definitely do decide matters, not necessarily always on the basis of 100% whether it is technically correct or not. They take into account matters such as this, as what other people might do as a result of their psak halacha, and that is called making a fence around the Torah. Says in Pirkei Avot, says siag la Torah, make a fence around the Torah, so that we don't come to violate a Torah law. It's a bit like the yellow line on the platform's edge. If you step over the yellow line, you won't fall off the platform. If you step off the platform, you'll fall off the platform. But to prevent you from even coming near to falling off the platform, they put a yellow line there, and they say, don't go over the yellow line. And that's what that's the idea here. So we're going to have to stop there for today. Next time we're going to find out why it is that you actually need something called smicha. We'll just do the question before we stop, just to whet your appetite. Yora, can he judge matters of kashrut, Shabbat, those kind of things? Yora, yes, he can. If he knows enough, so you get a very clever person who's learned lots of things, but he doesn't have smicha, he's not allowed to paskin shailas. Only somebody with smicha is allowed to paskin shailas. And the question of the Gemara is why? Why should that be? Just because somebody's got a certificate, somebody said you can do it, why should it be? Why can we not accept that there's some person who doesn't have the title, who hasn't done the exam, but we know he's a very, very learned person. Why can't he officially paskin halachot? And that is what we're going to learn next week. Well, actually not next week, because next Wednesday I shall be away. So 2 weeks today will be the next Gemarrah Chiya. Unless I can fit it in next Thursday. If I can, I'll send out a message. But as it's looking at the moment, it's unlikely that I'll be able to. So it will be 2 weeks today. So before we go, a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody's got questions. No questions. Jolly good. In that case, I shall bid you.
I have one question.
Okay.
In the piece we just read about Rav, that maybe he knew too much to be able to be certified to answer questions. That maybe he was overqualified, and that somebody else would draw from him the wrong conclusion. That's a really fascinating idea. And I can see how your explanation works, but it also seems very strange that they wouldn't maybe require him to give the reasons for his decision, and therefore it would be able to be separated or distinguished from any other fact situation.
Okay,
Is it because he was going away and was going to be in a different jurisdiction?
I think the fact is that the people were just not intellectually or educationally up to understanding the finer points. Only a Rav, I don't mean a rabbi, I'm Rav, I mean only a person like this man called Rav could understand these nuances and these subtleties, and these people were not educated enough to be able to understand that, and there was it was thought there was a significant danger that would happen. Yes, Marcel.
Your town of Kafri is actually in Bavel. It's 170 kilometers south of Baghdad. It's just north of the town of Najaf.
Thank you very much. That's much nearer than Capri. So that makes a lot more sense that all these people emanated from this guy in Kafri. Thank you very much to our resident geography expert. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm going to have to go, everyone. So see you in 2 weeks' time for Gemarrah, and no doubt before that for other things.
Thanks, Johnny.
Bye, everyone.